People around Hollow Bend always knew the Calder twins were different, but nobody dared say it out loud. In that isolated patch of land where the trees leaned too close and the wind carried whispers instead of sound, secrets grew deeper roots than crops ever did. For 13 generations, the Calders had followed one rule carved into their lineage with iron certainty. Twins must marry twins, or the land itself would take its due. Folks outside the valley thought it was superstition. Those inside knew better than to question it. Families who once asked why the Calders never mingled with outsiders had a habit of packing up suddenly, abandoning homes with meals still warm on the table. The tradition of the 13-generation pact did not begin as a superstition. It was born from a night the Calder ancestry refused to record openly, a night spoken about only in shivers and lowered voices. Long before Hollow Bend became a place marked by silence and dread, the Calders lived scattered across different homesteads, never imagining that the blood flowing through them carried something ancient. It started when the first recorded twins, Elias and Abram Calder, claimed they saw a figure made of smoke and bone in the woods. It whispered to them as they slept, appearing in their dreams with a voice that didn't echo, but vibrated straight into their spine. The creature's promise was simple. If the brothers stayed together in life and ensured their blood never split, the Calder line would prosper where others starved. The brothers dismissed it as exhaustion until crops withered around them, while theirs flourished untouched, and storms twisted away from their home, while neighbors' roofs tore off like paper. After seeing this happen again and again, the Calders realized the thing in the woods had not lied. The pact began quietly. Elias and Abram, identical in every way except the way they breathed when frightened, married twin sisters who seemed drawn to them almost unnaturally. The two pairs had their children on the same night in the same room, and the midwives swore the infants inhaled in perfect unison, as if guided by one unseen breath. When the next generation was born, the family elders insisted that the twins marry only twins, claiming that the symmetry pleased the watcher in the woods. Over time, the insistence hardened into law. Anyone who rebelled met strange misfortunes. A daughter who ran away with a man from another town died suddenly from an illness no doctor could name, and a son who tried to break the rule vanished in the ravine behind the old well. Only his shoes were ever found, placed neatly side by side, as if someone arranged them with deliberate care. As years passed, the pact twisted into something both feared and revered within the family. The Calders experienced wealth, health, and uncanny good fortune, but only as long as the twins honored their binding. Houses built by their ancestors stood untouched by rot. Their lands remained fertile even during the harshest winters, and their children were born strong with eyes that held an unsettling depth for newborns. Outsiders whispered that the family was touched by something unholy, but the Calders said nothing, believing that silence was a part of the agreement struck generations ago. 13 cycles of twins marrying twins preserved the pattern perfectly, and each generation felt the presence of the unseen watcher grow stronger, as if waiting for something, as if counting down toward a moment only it understood the birth of the 14th generation arrived with a sense of dread that even the oldest members of Hollow Bend could not ignore. Mara and Lyle were not born on a normal night. A rare lunar eclipse had cast the land in a deep red shadow, turning the trees into blackened silhouettes and bathing the Calder homestead in a light that seemed almost alive. The midwives, women who had delivered every twin in the family for decades, whispered nervously as they observed the baby's first movements. When Mara drew her first breath, Lyle followed exactly a second later, not out of coincidence, but as if their lungs were connected by some invisible tether. Neither cried in the way children usually did. Instead, they exhaled slowly and deliberately, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect harmony. The air in the room thickened, as if the house itself was leaning closer to watch them, and the flickering candle flames twisted toward the infants in unnatural angles. Even the elders felt a shiver crawl up their spines, recognizing the signs of a child who carried something beyond human understanding. From the first hours of their lives, the twins displayed differences that unsettled everyone who saw them. Their eyes did not match, Mara's deep and stormy, Lyle's sharp and almost metallic, and when they stared at the same object, it seemed to shift slightly in reflection, as if reality itself acknowledged that something extraordinary had arrived. Whispers spread through the household, warnings buried in murmurs about the old prophecy that no one spoke of plainly. Unlike previous generations, these twins were not simply inheritors of a lineage. They were harbingers of a change that had been centuries in the making. The elders felt it immediately. The balance the family had maintained for 13 generations had been disturbed, and the children's presence resonated with a force that made the wooden beams groan, the wind howl, and the dogs in the yard shiver uncontrollably. As days passed, subtle signs compounded into undeniable evidence that Mara and Lyle were different. Their cries, when they finally began, synchronized in a way that made the midwives uneasy, as though they were repeating the same phrase in some language no human knew. Shadows followed them across the nursery, sometimes stretching long into corners of the room where nothing should exist. Neighbors dared not approach the house, claiming that the air around it felt wrong, as if the wind itself carried a warning. The elders debated whether this generation should be allowed to grow naturally or whether intervention, an act that had never before been necessary, was required to contain whatever had been awakened. It became increasingly clear that the 14th generation of twins was not merely another link in the family chain. They embodied a disruption so profound that it might overturn the careful, centuries-old balance the Calders had maintained, threatening to unravel the lineage and awaken forces no one had faced before. The mirror ritual had always been the most sacred and secret of the Calder traditions, a ceremony passed down for generations, performed only when the eldest twins reached the age of 12. The purpose was said to be simple: to affirm the alignment of the bloodline, to ensure that the twin souls were synchronized, and that the pact forged 13 generations ago remained unbroken. For decades, the ritual had been uneventful, a quiet night of candles and reflection, a communion with something ancient that no one outside the family could name. But when Mara and Lyle were brought to the Hall of Mirrors for the first time, the air in the room felt different, heavier, charged with a presence that made the hairs on the nape of the elder's neck stand on end. The candles flickered without wind, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch independently, and the polished glass surfaces reflected more than the twins themselves, capturing shapes and movements that did not exist. The twins stood at the center of the hall, hand in hand, their reflections perfectly synchronized at first. The ritual required them to gaze into the mirrors while reciting the phrases taught to them since infancy, words designed to anchor their spirits and bind them to the family line. At first, everything seemed normal, the soft echoes of their voices bouncing against the cold walls. But gradually, a subtle discord began to appear. One reflection would tilt its head slightly before the other, a smile creeping across a face when the real twin's expression remained neutral. The elders exchanged worried glances, but the words of the ritual demanded they remain silent, their authority tested against an unfolding anomaly. As the ceremony continued, the divergence grew impossible to ignore. The mirrored Mara and Lyle began moving independently, gesturing in ways the twins did not, performing subtle actions that seemed deliberate, meaningful, and directed at no one in the room. One mirror image reached toward the opposite twin's reflection with fingers that never touched reality, while the twins themselves remained perfectly still, oblivious or unable to respond. The air vibrated with an almost imperceptible hum, low and insistent, as if the hall itself were resonating with the presence of something not bound by human laws. The elders, the torchbearers of centuries of tradition, felt a deep unease settle into their bones. The ritual that had always reaffirmed the family's stability now hinted at a fracture, an awakening they had never anticipated. Whispers passed from mirror to mirror, shadows flickered at impossible angles, and the line between reflection and reality blurred into a tension that held the room captive. By the time the ritual concluded, the hall felt altered, as if the walls themselves remembered what had occurred. The twins' reflections returned to their normal positions, but the unease remained, a living thing in the room. The elders understood in that instant that the 14th generation had crossed a threshold no previous Calder had ever approached, and the mirror ritual, intended to bind them, had instead revealed a presence that might be beyond containment, something that had waited patiently through 13 generations to make itself known. The first signs of the darkening did not appear in the Calder house itself, but in the world around it. Subtle disturbances that unsettled the villagers of Hollow Bend. Before they could fully understand what was happening, animals, which had always been calm and obedient in the presence of the family, began behaving strangely, as though the air around the Calder property carried a different law of nature. Crows gathered in silent clusters atop the gnarled oaks, refusing to take flight even when threatened, their eyes reflecting a depth that suggested comprehension beyond instinct. Dogs howled at walls where no one stood, scratching at doors as if trying to escape an unseen pressure. Cats arched their spines and hissed at shadows that did not belong to anyone, vanishing into the woods for hours, returning only when the wind shifted direction. Livestock refused to enter barns, circling instead in anxious patterns, their low moans resonating through the empty fields, as if warning of some encroaching presence. The villagers whispered that the Calder land was cursed, though none dared confront the family about it directly. Travelers who passed too close often reported a feeling of being watched, a heaviness pressing on their chests that made it difficult to breathe. Some claimed the air shimmered, almost liquid in its density, bending the light in ways that could not be explained. Crops near the Calder property, once lush and thriving, began to twist unnaturally, stems curling in impossible angles, leaves yellowing as if life itself recoiled. Those who ventured into the woods reported hearing whispers on the wind, a sibilant voice repeating phrases that made no sense, yet carried an unmistakable weight, like a summons or a warning. The family itself noticed the changes with growing alarm, though outwardly, the elders maintained calm. Mara and Lyle, the newest generation, seemed to draw the disturbances closer, their presence amplifying the unnatural behavior. When the twins walked through the yard, the animals scattered in erratic patterns, shadows stretching toward the children like tendrils of darkness. Even inanimate objects seemed to respond. Doors creaked open slowly when the twins approached, the surface of water in troughs rippled without wind, and the faintest tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet, subtle but undeniable. As the phenomena escalated, the tension in Hollow Bend thickened into fear. Villagers who had once tolerated the family's peculiar ways now avoided the Calder homestead entirely, speaking only in hurried whispers about the unnatural alignment of events. The air around the property felt charged, a living current that hinted at some intelligence lurking just beyond perception. The elders, though accustomed to centuries of tradition, understood instinctively that these signs were not mere coincidence. Something deeper had begun to stir, something that had waited patiently for the 14th generation, responding to the twins in ways the previous generations had never provoked. The darkening was no longer subtle. It had begun to assert itself, reaching into the woods, the fields, and the very air of Hollow Bend, a warning that the balance of the Calder line was beginning to unravel under a presence that no one had yet dared to name. The unsettling signs extended beyond the living world, creeping into the resting places of those who had come before. In the graveyard behind the Calder homestead, the oldest twin headstones, carved meticulously by ancestors who prided themselves on symmetry and permanence, began to shift in ways that defied explanation. Cracks appeared down the center of many stones, some splitting cleanly, as if an invisible force had scored them with deliberate precision. Others tilted, leaning slightly toward the old well where the first Calder twins had been purified, in a ritual that no villager dared describe aloud. The elders noticed immediately, their faces pale, knowing that the ground itself seemed to respond to the arrival of Mara and Lyle, acknowledging that the centuries-old lineage was no longer as stable as it had appeared. At first, the disturbances were subtle. A headstone would rock faintly when the wind blew in a particular direction, or a fissure would lengthen overnight, as though the stone itself was breathing. But as the days passed, the shifts became impossible to ignore. Families who had tended the cemetery for generations reported strange phenomena. Flowers placed at graves wilted almost instantly. Dirt mounded on certain plots would settle in patterns that resembled two small, clasped hands, and the soil seemed unusually cold, even in the heat of summer. Some villagers claimed that during moonlit nights, shadows moved independently across the gravestones, forming shapes reminiscent of twin figures watching the living from their eternal rest. Whispers spread, quietly at first, then with growing urgency, that the dead themselves were restless, responding to the arrival of the 14th generation in ways that had never before occurred. The well, long considered a place of reverence and fear, became the focal point of unease. Its waters, still and black, seemed to ripple when the twins passed nearby, reflecting their images not as they appeared, but twisted and elongated, as though the spirits of ancestors had risen to witness what was unfolding. Villagers dared not approach, sensing an invisible boundary of danger. Even the elders, whose knowledge of rituals was unmatched, felt an instinctive dread at the sight of the gravestone's shifting alignment, recognizing that the ancestral energy, carefully maintained through 13 generations, was reacting violently to the presence of Mara and Lyle. By the end of the week, the cemetery no longer resembled a place of peaceful rest. The land around the graves seemed tense, charged with a silent energy that suggested intelligence, awareness, and warning. Every tilt, every crack, every subtle movement of stone communicated a single, undeniable truth. The past was stirring in response to the present. The 12 generations that had preceded the new twins were no longer inert, no longer passive observers. Their legacy, bound to the bloodline and the pact, had begun to awaken in a way that foreshadowed something larger, darker, and unstoppable, signaling that the 14th generation was not merely inheriting the family line. They were altering it in ways that even the oldest and wisest among the Calders had never imagined from the earliest days. Mara and Lyle exhibited a connection that went far beyond what any previous generation of Calders had shown. At first, it seemed almost charming, a shared glance that spoke volumes, a laugh that echoed perfectly in unison, gestures mirrored so precisely they appeared rehearsed. But as they grew, the synchrony became unsettling, creeping into every aspect of their behavior and defying the natural boundaries of individuality. Words spoken by one would be completed by the other before a pause could be measured, as if the two shared a single mind, a consciousness folded into itself. Conversation with the twins became an exercise in disorientation, for one could speak to Lyle and feel Mara's presence in the response as strongly as if addressing her directly. The elders, once proud of the lineage's orderly growth, began to feel unease creep along the spines of their tradition, sensing that the 14th generation was no longer simply human in the way they had always understood humanity. The physical manifestations of their connection were equally disturbing. Whenever the twins stood too close together, their skin would turn unusually cold, as if the warmth of life itself had been drained from their bodies and pooled somewhere between them. When they touched, even briefly, the air around them seemed to tighten, pressing on the room like invisible hands. Their movements became so synchronized that observers could no longer tell where one ended and the other began, a fluid continuity that suggested a fusion of forms rather than two separate individuals. Mirrors and polished surfaces amplified the effect. When Mara moved, Lyle's reflection would sometimes lag fractionally behind hers, or move independently, creating a momentary dissonance that unsettled even the most stoic elders. The twins' minds seemed similarly linked, developing an awareness that bordered on precognition. If one was frightened, the other reacted instantaneously, often before any external cause had occurred. They began finishing each other's sentences in ways that implied knowledge of thoughts yet unspoken, displaying a depth of understanding that could not be taught. Even the family dogs and livestock responded differently around them, hesitating, trembling, or refusing to enter their presence, as though sensing the twins' unnatural bond. In hushed conversations, the elders admitted privately that the twins were no longer simply part of the lineage. They were becoming a vessel for something larger, a shared entity that carried the weight of 13 generations' worth of blood, secrets, and ritual. The awareness of this emerging fusion brought both awe and dread. Mara and Lyle were not merely connected by blood. They were a singular force, a concentration of the Calder legacy that transcended ordinary life. Their presence hinted at the possibility of a consciousness that no single twin had ever held alone, a melding that carried with it powers, insights, and dangers that could not be contained by the walls of the house, the boundaries of the valley, or the traditions that had held the family together for centuries. Each passing day brought the realization that the twins were evolving, not as children of the Calder line, but as something the line itself had been shaping, something that might no longer answer to the living, but to the echoes of the generations that had come before. The elders of the Calder family had long been the keepers of knowledge, the ones who maintained the delicate balance of tradition and power that had sustained 13 generations. When they observed the unnatural synchronization of Mara and Lyle, the way the twins spoke and moved as if one mind governed two bodies, their unease deepened into fear. They knew that the alignment of the bloodline was no longer stable, and for the first time in centuries, they contemplated breaking the very rules they had enforced for so long. The severing, a ritual forbidden for generations and spoken of only in hushed warnings, was designed to separate twins spiritually, to restore individuality and sever the unnatural bonds that might threaten the family line. The elders debated in secret chambers, their voices trembling with the weight of centuries, knowing that attempting the ritual was dangerous, but doing nothing might allow forces beyond their comprehension to grow unchecked. On a night when the wind carried a biting chill and the fog settled thick over Hollow Bend, the elders gathered in the Hall of Mirrors once more, the same place where the children's reflections had first betrayed signs of independence. Candles lined the walls, casting flickering light that danced across the glass and amplified the tension in the room. The twins were placed in the center, hands clasped though their grip felt unnatural, as if resisting the ritual about to be performed. The elders recited incantations that had been buried in the family archives, words meant to untangle the intertwined consciousness of the twins, to pull Mara and Lyle apart without breaking their physical forms. The air vibrated with energy, the temperature dropping sharply as if the house itself were bracing for impact. But the severing did not proceed as intended. The first notes of the incantation barely left the elders' lips when the mirrors shuddered violently, and the reflections of the twins began to warp, twisting into shapes that no human eye should witness. Shadowed figures appeared behind the mirrored images, resembling every twin who had ever lived in Hollow Bend, their faces indistinct but their presence palpable. A low hum filled the room, resonating through walls and floors, and the elders realized with terror that the ritual had not separated the twins. It had awakened something that had slumbered in the bloodline for generations. The twins themselves went rigid, their unison voice rising in a tone that carried both innocence and something far older, something that seemed to pierce the very air with intent. What the elders had tried to contain now responded, not with malice, but with inevitability. Mara and Lyle were no longer merely children of the Calder line. They had become conduits for the fused spirits of generations past. The severing, meant to protect the family, had instead called forth the ancestral consciousness that had waited patiently for the 14th generation. The mirrors reflected not just twins, but echoes of everyone who had ever lived in the lineage, moving in a way that suggested thought, desire, and awareness. The elders understood, with a cold clarity that left them breathless, that the ritual had failed utterly, and that what they had attempted to control was far older and far more powerful than anything they had prepared for. By the time the twins had reached the age of 12, it became painfully clear that Mara and Lyle were no longer ordinary children, and that the forces within them had grown beyond the comprehension of the Calder elders. The fusion of 13 generations had reached its culmination, and the 14th generation was no longer merely a vessel carrying potential. It was the vessel made manifest, a living entity that carried the consciousness, desires, and memories of every twin who had come before. The children's movements, speech, and even the subtle cadence of their breathing seemed dictated not by their own will, but by a collective mind older than Hollow Bend itself. The villagers began noticing disturbing signs, shadows that mimicked the twins' gestures long after they had moved, whispers that floated through the mist without a visible source, and fleeting glimpses of shapes at the edge of vision that resembled twin figures intertwined in ways no human form could sustain. Animals continued to react with heightened fear. Livestock refused to enter fields where the twins walked. Crows perched silently in tight clusters, and the family dogs whimpered at corners of the house where nothing stood. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation, as if the valley itself recognized the awakening of something primordial. Those who dared approach the Calder homestead reported a sensation of being watched, not by children, but by many eyes at once, all inhabiting a single presence. Even the wind carried a low, resonant vibration that made the skin crawl and the heart pound, a warning echoing from deep within the land. Inside the house, Mara and Lyle began to act with an unnerving autonomy. Their voices overlapped in perfect harmony, completing thoughts that none of the living twins could have conceived alone. They moved as one but occupied multiple planes of awareness, observing the room, the house, and the world beyond with a depth that chilled the elders. When touched, the twins were simultaneously warm and ice-cold, their skin betraying the unnatural duality of their existence. Their eyes, mismatched in color yet synchronized in perception, seemed to see not only the present but layers of time folded together, glimpses of ancestors who had lived and died, and a future yet to unfold. The elders, who had once sought to guide and contain the line, realized the terrifying truth. Mara and Lyle were no longer governed by the family, the rituals, or even mortality itself. They were the culmination of a dark legacy, a consciousness forged over centuries, and now fully awake in the bodies of the living. The 13 generations before them had fused, creating a will that was patient, relentless, and bound to reclaim its place in the physical world. The twins were merely vessels, conduits for something far older than the valley, something that demanded recognition, movement, and dominion over what had been shaped in secret for centuries. With each passing hour, the awareness of the entity grew stronger, and the elders could feel that the time for subtlety, for concealment, had passed entirely. The dark bloodline had awakened, and it was beginning its work in the world of the living.